In the sweltering heat of a forgotten frontier town, where dust settles on broken dreams and desperation hangs thick as summer air, a woman heavy with child dismounts her weary horse. The slave auction block stands before her like a monument. To human cruelty and chained upon it is a cowboy whose spirit refuses to break despite the iron around his wrists. Mae Henderson has traveled 300 miles with nothing but determination and her last silver dollar. She came to this godforsaken place seeking a new beginning, but fate has other plans. The auctioneer's hammer rises, ready to seal another man's bondage, when something deep inside her stirs. Not the child she carries, but something fiercer. In that moment, she makes a choice that will change both their lives forever. But when a man who's known only captivity suddenly finds himself free, what does he owe the woman who saved him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Perdition Creek as Mae Henderson adjusted the worn shawl around her shoulders, trying to hide the swell of her belly beneath the faded calico dress. 6 months along now, and showing more each day, despite her best efforts to disguise her condition. She'd learned quickly that a pregnant woman traveling alone drew the wrong kind of attention in these frontier towns, pity at best, predatory interest at worst. Her fingers traced the thin gold band on her left hand, a habit she'd developed over the past year since Thomas had been laid to rest. The ring had belonged to his mother before him, passed down through 3 generations of Henderson women who'd all outlived their husbands. Mae wondered if she'd be the 4th to carry that particular burden, though at 26 she felt ancient already. The slave auction had been a grotesque spectacle, even by frontier standards. Men, women, and children lined up like livestock, while well-dressed buyers examined them like prize cattle. Mae had only intended to pass through Perdition Creek on her way to California, but something about the cowboy on the auction block had stopped her cold. Jacob Sterling, she'd learned. His name, from the auctioneer's crude introduction, stood 6 feet tall, with shoulders that spoke of years of hard labor. His dark hair hung past his collar, matted with sweat and dirt, and several days' worth of beard couldn't hide the strong jaw beneath. But it was his eyes that had captured her attention. Green as spring grass, they held a quiet dignity that all the chains in the world couldn't break. When the bidding started at $50, Mae felt her heart sink. She had exactly $53.27 to her name. Every penny she owned in the world. It was supposed to last her until she reached her sister in Sacramento, supposed to buy passage on a wagon train and provisions for the journey. But as she watched those green eyes search the crowd, she found herself raising her hand. $55, she called out, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The auctioneer, a sweaty man with tobacco-stained teeth, looked surprised. 55 from the lady in blue. Do I hear 60? A rancher in a fine suit raised his hand. 60. Mae's breath caught. She could bid 65, but that would leave her with precious little for the road ahead. She looked at Jacob Sterling again, saw the resignation creeping into those remarkable eyes, and made a decision that would change everything. 75, she said, louder this time. The crowd turned to stare at her, whispers rippling through. The assembly. A pregnant woman buying a strong man, raised eyebrows and questions she wasn't prepared to answer. The rancher shook his head and stepped back, unwilling to bid against what he probably assumed was desperation. "Sold to the lady for $75, the auctioneer declared, bringing his hammer down with a sharp crack. Now, 3 hours later, Mae found herself in the peculiar position of owning another human being. The very thought made her stomach turn. She'd been raised to believe all people were equal in God's eyes, a radical notion that had gotten her father into trouble more than once back in Missouri. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd used the last of her money to buy a man's freedom. only to find herself in the position of his master. Jacob Sterling sat across from her in the cramped room above Murphy's saloon, the only accommodation she could afford in Perdition Creek. The shackles were gone, but the red marks around his wrists and ankles told the story of months, maybe years, in bondage. He'd accepted the bowl of stew she'd bought him without a word, eating with the careful, measured movements of a man who'd learned not to waste food. "You don't have to stay," Sarah Mae said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between them since leaving the auction. "I mean, I know legally you're... but that's not why I..." She stopped, frustrated by her inability to find the right words. Jacob looked up from his stew, those green eyes studying her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Why did you buy me?" The question was simple, but the answer wasn't. Sarah Mae pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and moved to the small window overlooking the street. "I saw you up there, and I thought about what it would feel like to be in your place, to have people looking at you like you were property instead of a person, and," she turned back to face him, "and I had $53 to my name, which wasn't going to get me very far anyway. Figured it might as well go towards something worthwhile." Jacob set down his spoon and leaned back in the rickety chair. "You spent your traveling money on me." "I did. Why?" Sarah Mae felt heat rise in her cheeks. How could she explain the impulse that had driven her to that auction block? How could she tell this stranger that she'd seen something in his eyes that reminded her of her own desperate situation, that she'd recognized the look of someone who'd lost everything but hadn't given up hope? "I reckon we're both running from something," she said instead. "Figured we might run together, at least for a while." "What makes you think I'm running?" Sarah Mae allowed herself a small smile. "A man doesn't end up on a slave auction block because he's living a peaceful life. Besides, you got that look about you. Same one I see in the mirror every morning." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his fingers unconsciously rubbing the marks on his wrists. "Where are you headed?" "California. My sister lives in Sacramento. She's got a boarding house there, says she can give me work until..." Sarah Mae gestured vaguely at her belly. "Until the baby comes." "Yes. And the father?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a campfire. Sarah Mae's hand went instinctively to her wedding ring, twisting it around her finger. "Dead. Killed. In a farming accident 8 months back. It wasn't entirely a lie. Thomas Henderson had died in an accident involving his plow and a spooked horse. What she didn't mention was that she'd been 3 months pregnant when it happened, and the baby wasn't his. That particular shame was hers to carry alone." "I'm sorry," Jacob said, and the sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. "Thank you. What about you? What's your story?" Jacob's expression darkened. "Nothing worth telling." "Try me." He shook his head. "Some stories are better left buried." Sarah Mae studied his face, noting the way his jaw tightened and his eyes grew distant. Whatever had happened to put him on that auction block had cut deep. She recognized the look of a man carrying more than his share of pain. "All right," she said, "but if we're going to travel together, I need to know one thing. Are you dangerous?" "Not to you." "That's not what I asked." Jacob met her gaze steadily. "I've never hurt a woman or child, and I never will. Beyond that, it depends on who's asking and why." It wasn't exactly a comforting answer, but something in his tone convinced her he was telling the truth. Sarah Mae had learned to read people out of necessity, a skill that had kept her alive through the worst months of her marriage and the difficult months since. "The way I see it," she continued, "we both need to get to California, and neither of us has the resources to make the journey alone. I've got a horse and a little money left. You're..." She paused, searching for a diplomatic way to phrase it. "I'm..." "What?" "You're a man, and despite what some folks might think, a woman in my condition traveling alone faces certain dangers that a woman traveling with a man doesn't." Jacob's mouth quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "You want me to pretend to be your husband. I want you to help me get to California safely. In exchange, I'll help you get there too. What you do once we arrive is your business. And if I refuse," Sarah Mae shrugged, "then you're free to go. Like I said, I didn't buy you to own you. I bought you to free you. Jacob stood and walked to the window, his tall frame filling the small space. He stared down at the street for a long time, watching the evening crowds stumble between saloons and gambling halls. Sarah Mae waited, her heart beating faster than she cared to admit. She hadn't realized how much she wanted him to say yes until faced with the possibility of hearing no. "There are men looking for me," he said finally. "What kind of men?" A kind that don't give up easy." Sarah Mae felt a chill run down her spine, but she kept her voice steady. "How many?" "Hard to say. Could be 2, could be 10. They've been tracking me for the better part of a year." "Why?" Jacob turned back to face. You sure you want to know?" "Yes." He was quiet for another long moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "They say I killed a man in cold blood, robbed him and left him to die on the side of the road." Sarah Mae felt her stomach drop. "Did you?" "No. But they don't believe you. Doesn't matter what they believe. They've got a bounty poster with my face on it and a reward that's worth more than most men make in a year." Sarah Mae sank into the room's single chair, her mind racing. She'd just spent her last dollars buying the freedom of a wanted man. The smart thing would be to wish him well and send him on his way before she got caught up in whatever trouble was following him. Instead, she heard herself asking, "How much is the bounty?" $500, dead or alive. $500. More money than Sarah Mae had ever seen in one place. Enough to buy passage to California in comfort. Enough to set herself up properly before the baby came. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what that kind of money could mean for her future. Then she looked at Jacob Sterling's face and saw the careful blankness that had settled over his features. He was waiting for her to betray him, expecting it even. The realization made her angry, not at him, but at whatever had happened to make him so certain that betrayal was inevitable. "Well," she said, standing up and smoothing her skirts, "I reckon that settles it." "Settles what?" "We definitely need to travel together. If there are bounty hunters looking for you and you're traveling, alone you'll be easy to spot. But a man traveling with his pregnant wife, that's just another pioneer family heading west." Jacob stared at her as if she'd sprouted a second head. "You're not serious. Dead serious. Besides, $500 says those bounty hunters aren't the type to ask questions first and shoot later. If they're willing to bring you in dead, they might not be too particular about who gets hurt in the process. Which is exactly why you should stay away from me." Sarah Mae moved closer to the window, studying his profile in the lamplight. "Jacob Sterling, I spent the last of my money buying your freedom today. I'm 6 months pregnant, nearly broke, and 1,000 miles from the only family I have left. I'm pretty sure my situation can't get much worse. You'd be surprised. Maybe, but I'd rather face whatever's coming with help than face it alone." She turned to meet his eyes. "The question is, would you?" Jacob was quiet for so long that Sarah Mae began to think he wouldn't answer. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I suppose I would." "Good. Then it's settled. We leave at first light." "Just like that?" Sarah Mae managed a smile that felt more confident than she felt. "Just like that. Though I should probably warn you, I've never been married before, so I might not be very good at pretending to be your wife. I've never been married either, so I reckon we'll figure it out as we go." Something in his tone made her look at him more closely. There was a vulnerability in his expression that hadn't been there before, a crack in the careful walls he'd built around himself. Sarah Mae realized that whatever had put him on that auction block had cost him more than just his freedom. "Jacob, yes, I know you don't want to talk about what happened to you, and I respect that. But if we're going to do this, I need to know. You're not going to disappear in the middle of the night and leave me stranded." He met her gaze directly. "I give you my word. If you're willing to trust me this far, I'll see you safely to California. And then we'll see." It wasn't a promise of forever, but it was enough for now. Sarah Mae nodded and began gathering her few belongings. Tomorrow, they would begin a journey that would take them across some of the most dangerous territory in the country, pursued by men who had no qualms about killing. She should have been terrified. Instead, for the first time in months, she felt something that might have been hope. They had been on the trail for 3 days when Sarah Mae saw the poster. The trading post at Willow Creek was little more than a collection of weathered buildings squatting beside a muddy stream, but it was the first sign of civilization they'd encountered since leaving Perdition Creek. Sarah Mae's horse, a gentle mare named Bessie, needed water and rest, and their supplies were running dangerously low. Jacob had been quiet for most of the journey, riding alongside her on the horse she'd managed to buy with her remaining few dollars, a scrappy gelding that the stable owner had been eager to unload. They'd fallen into an easy rhythm of traveling during the cooler morning and evening hours, resting during the heat of midday. Their conversations had been limited to practical matters: which direction to head, where to make camp, how to ration their meager supplies. Sarah Mae had begun to think that perhaps the bounty hunters Jacob feared were more phantom than reality. 3 days of peaceful travel had lulled her into a sense of security that shattered the moment she stepped into the trading post. The poster was nailed to a wooden beam near the counter, positioned where every customer would be sure to see it. The ink was fresh, the paper crisp. This wasn't some old notice that had been hanging there for months. Someone had put it up recently, maybe even that morning. "Wanted, dead or alive," the header proclaimed in bold letters. Below it was a surprisingly accurate sketch of Jacob Sterling, though the artist had made him look more menacing than the man she'd come to know. The details made her blood run cold. Jacob Sterling, age 29, wanted for the murder of Samuel Morrison and theft of $2,000 in gold. Last seen in the vicinity of Perdition Creek, $500 reward. But it was the line at the bottom that made her stomach drop. Known to be traveling with a pregnant woman. Both should be considered armed and dangerous. "Help you with something, ma'am?" The trading post owner, a grizzled man with suspicious eyes, had noticed her staring at the poster. Sarah Mae forced a smile and moved toward the shelves of supplies. "Just looking for some coffee and beans, and maybe some information about the trail ahead." Trail's rough going toward Sacramento. Lot of unsavory types between here and there. His eyes lingered on her belly, then moved to the window where Jacob waited with the horses. "That your husband out there?" "Yes," Sarah Mae said, praying her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "We're heading west to join my sister." "Uh-huh." The man's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "You folks wouldn't happen to have seen anything of this fellow, would you?" He nodded toward the poster. Sarah Mae's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to look at the poster again, as if seeing it for the first time. "Can't say that I have." "Why? Has he been through here?" "Not yet, but word is he's headed this way. Killed a man up in Colorado Territory, they say. Took his gold and left him for the buzzards." The trading post owner leaned across the counter conspiratorially. "Between you and me, Mom, you might want to be extra careful on the trail." "Man, like that? Traveling with a woman in your condition? Well, let's just say he's probably not too particular about who he hurts." "I see." Sarah Mae gathered the supplies she needed with hands that she hoped weren't shaking visibly. "How much do I owe you?" "That'll be $4 even." Sarah Mae counted out the money, acutely aware that it left her with less than $10 to her name. As she prepared to leave, the trading post owner called after her. "Ma'am, you seem like good folks. Just be careful out there. And if you do see this Sterling fellow, don't try to be a hero. Get yourself and your husband to the nearest town and let the law handle it." "I'll keep that in mind," Sarah Mae said, and hurried outside. Jacob was watering the horses at the creek when she approached, her mind racing with everything she'd just learned. The poster had been specific. Too specific. Someone knew they were traveling together, knew about her pregnancy. That meant they were being tracked more closely than either of them had realized. "We need to go," she said quietly, glancing back at the trading post to make sure they weren't being overheard. Jacob looked up from Bessie's bridle. "What's wrong?" Not here. Let's get back on the trail. Something in her tone must have conveyed the urgency she felt, because Jacob didn't argue. They mounted up and rode in silence until they were well away from the trading post, following a narrow path that led deeper into the scrubland. Finally, when Sarah Mae was certain they were alone, she pulled Bessie to a stop in the shade of a cluster of cottonwood trees. There's a bounty poster, she said without preamble. Fresh one. It describes you perfectly, and it mentions me. Jacob's face went very still. What does it say? Sarah Mae pulled the folded paper from her pocket. She'd managed to tear it down when the trading post owner wasn't looking. See for yourself. Jacob read the poster in silence, his jaw tightening with each line. When he finished, he folded it carefully and handed it back to her. Sarah Mae, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I'm listening. The man they say I killed, Samuel Morrison, was my father's business partner. He was also the man who raised me after my parents died. Sarah Mae felt as if someone had punched her in the stomach. Jacob, I didn't kill him, he said firmly. But the man who did has made very sure that all the evidence points to me. Who? Who would do such a thing? Jacob's eyes were distant, lost in painful memories. My brother, my own blood. The words hung in the air between them like a curse. Sarah Mae tried to process what she was hearing, tried to reconcile the gentle man she'd come to know with the cold-blooded killer described on the poster. Tell me what happened, she said quietly. Jacob dismounted and began pacing beside the creek, his hands clenched into fists. Samuel Morrison owned a ranch about 50 miles outside of Denver. Good land, good water, cattle that bred true. My brother Marcus and I worked for him since we were boys. Samuel never married, never had children of his own. He treated us like sons. But Marcus always wanted more. He thought Samuel should have left him the ranch in his will, thought he'd earned it through years of hard work. When Samuel told us he was planning to sell the ranch and split the money between us, Marcus, he didn't take it well. Sarah Mae sank down onto a fallen log, her pregnant belly making the movement awkward. What did he do? He started stealing cattle, selling them and keeping the money. When Samuel found out, he threatened to turn Marcus over to the law. That's when Marcus decided that Samuel had to die, and he framed you for it. Jacob nodded grimly, made it look like I was the one stealing cattle, planted stolen gold in my saddlebags. Then one night, when Samuel was riding back from town alone, Marcus bushwhacked him, made sure there were witnesses who saw me riding in that direction earlier in the day. But surely there was evidence. Marcus is smart, always was the clever one. He made sure every piece of evidence pointed to me, then played the grieving surrogate son when Samuel's body was found, even had tears in his eyes when he identified me as the killer. Sarah Mae felt sick. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that it took her breath away. Your own brother, my own brother, Jacob confirmed. The same man who taught me to ride, who stood beside me at Samuel's funeral, who promised to help me clear my name. His laugh was bitter. He probably volunteers for every posse that goes out looking for me. Jacob, I'm so sorry. He stopped pacing and looked at her directly. Sarah Mae, these men who are coming for me, they're not just bounty hunters looking for easy money. Some of them might be, but Marcus will be leading them, and he won't hesitate to hurt you if it means getting to me. What are you saying? I'm saying you need to get as far away from me as possible. Tonight, take Bessie and what money you have left and head for the nearest town. Tell them you escaped from me, that I kidnapped you or threatened you. They'll believe you. Pregnant. Women don't generally choose to travel with wanted killers. Sarah Mae stood up slowly, her hand resting on her swollen belly. And leave you to face them alone. It's the only way you'll be safe. No. Sarah Mae, no, she said more firmly. I didn't spend my last dollar buying your freedom just to abandon you the first time things get dangerous. This isn't some romantic adventure, Jacob said harshly. These men will kill me, and they won't think twice about killing you too if you get in their way. Maybe, But I'll tell you something, Jacob Sterling. I've been running from one thing or another my whole life. I ran from my father when he drank too much and used his fists to make his points. I ran from the town gossips when Thomas died and left me pregnant with another man's child. I ran from Missouri when the whispers got too loud to bear. She took a step closer to him. I'm tired of running. This is different, is it? Because from where I stand, it looks like we're both being hunted by people who want to destroy us for things we didn't do wrong. You for a murder you didn't commit. Me for carrying a baby that proves I'm not the perfect widow everyone expected me to be. Jacob stared at her for a long moment. You said the baby wasn't your husband's. Sarah Mae felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't look away. No, it wasn't. Thomas and I, we hadn't been close in a long time. The baby belongs to a man who promised to marry me after Thomas died, then changed his mind when he realized people might talk. And that's why you left Missouri. That's why I left everywhere. But I'm not running anymore, Jacob. We're stronger together than we are apart. Those bounty hunters are looking for a desperate killer traveling with a helpless pregnant woman. Let's give them something they're not expecting. What do you mean? Sarah Mae smiled, and for the first time since seeing the poster, she felt a spark of hope. I mean, let's disappear, not by splitting up, but by becoming people they're not looking for. I don't understand. The poster says you're armed and dangerous. It says I'm traveling with you against my will. But what if we weren't Jacob Sterling? And his victim? What if we were, I don't know, John and Mary Thompson, a young married couple heading west to start a family? Jacob considered this. You think we could fool them? I think we have to try. Because the alternative is letting your brother win, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let that happen. For the first time since she'd known him, Jacob Sterling smiled, really smiled, not just a polite curve of his lips. You're either very brave or very foolish. Sarah Mae Henderson. Probably both, but I'd rather be brave and foolish with you than safe and alone anywhere else. Jacob walked over to where she stood and took her hands in his. His palms were rough from years of ranch work, but his touch was gentle. If we do this, if we really do this, there's no going back. Once we're committed to this path, we'll have to see it through to the end. I know, and you're willing to. I take that risk. For me? Sarah Mae looked into his green eyes and saw something there that took her breath away. Not just gratitude, but something deeper. Something that made her believe that maybe, just maybe, they could build something real. Together, out of all this deception and danger. Jacob, 3 days ago, I was a pregnant widow with no future and no hope. Today I'm a pregnant widow with no future, no hope, and a partner who's willing to face whatever comes next with me. That's not a step backward. He squeezed her hands gently. Then, we'd better figure out how to become John and Mary Thompson in a hurry. Already working on it, Sarah Mae said, her mind racing with possibilities. But first, we need to get rid of that poster and any others like it. And we need to change our appearance enough that casual observers won't recognize us. The hair, Jacob said immediately, it's too distinctive. Mine too, and the clothes. We need to look more prosperous, less like refugees. That'll take money we don't have, Sarah Mae smiled. Leave that to me. I have an idea. As they remounted their horses and continued down the trail, Sarah Mae felt a strange sense of exhilaration. Yes, they were being hunted by dangerous men. Yes, their situation had just become infinitely more perilous. But for the first time since Thomas died, she felt like she was moving toward something instead of running away from it. The wanted poster crackled in her pocket as Bessie's hooves found their rhythm on the dusty trail. Sarah Mae Henderson was about to disappear forever. In her place would be Mary Thompson, devoted wife and expectant mother. She just hoped Jacob Sterling would prove as good at disappearing as she was beginning to suspect she might be. The transformation began at sunset, beside a creek that wound through a stand of aspens 20 miles from the trading post. Sarah Mae had insisted they travel hard after discovering the bounty poster, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and anyone who might have seen them at Willow Creek. Now, as the golden light filtered through the trees, she pulled a small wooden box from her saddlebags and set it on a flat rock beside the water. Inside, carefully wrapped in cloth, was a pair of scissors that had belonged to her mother, along with a small mirror and a cake of soap. "You're serious about this," Jacob said, watching her prepare. Dead serious. Sarah Mae unwound the long braid that fell past her shoulders. In the dying light, her hair caught fire, auburn streaks threading through brown, a color that Jacob had noticed but never commented on. "The poster described me as having long brown hair. Mary Thompson is going to be a blonde with a fashionable bob. Where exactly are you planning to get blonde hair?" Sarah Mae smiled and pulled a small bottle from the box. "Lemon juice and chamomile tea. My sister taught me the trick when we were girls. It won't make me platinum, but it'll lighten my hair enough to change my appearance." Jacob picked up his own reflection in the mirror she'd propped against a tree branch. His dark hair had grown long during his months in captivity, and his beard was unkempt. The man staring back at him looked every inch the dangerous outlaw from the bounty poster. "What about me?" "Clean-shaven," Sarah Mae said without hesitation. "Your beard hides too much of your face, and we'll cut your hair shorter, more like a businessman or a clerk." "I haven't been clean-shaven since I was 16. "Then it's time." She handed him the scissors and soap. "Besides, I want to see what you really look like under all that hair." There was something intimate about the suggestion that made Jacob's stomach flutter in a way he hadn't experienced in years. He took the scissors and soap, then looked at the creek flowing past their campsite. "The water's going to be cold." "I imagine it will be. But John Thompson is the kind of man who takes pride in his appearance, even on the trail." They worked in companionable silence as full darkness settled around them. Jacob stripped to the waist and knelt beside the creek, using the soap and cold water to work up a lather. Sarah Mae had turned away to give him privacy, but not before he caught her looking at the scars that crisscrossed his back and shoulders. Souvenirs from his months in chains. The beard came off in careful strokes, revealing a face that Jacob barely recognized. Without the facial hair, he looked younger, less threatening. The strong jaw that the beard had hidden was now prominent, and his green eyes seemed larger somehow. "Better," Sarah Mae said when he finished. She'd been busy with her own transformation, working the lemon juice and chamomile mixture through her hair. Now, the hair. Cutting a man's hair by firelight with a pair of household scissors was more challenging than either of them had anticipated. Sarah Mae had to stand close to him, her pregnant belly occasionally brushing against his arm as she worked. Jacob found himself acutely aware of her presence, the scent of the herbal mixture in her hair, the gentle touch of her fingers as she combed through the dark strands. "Hold still," she murmured, her breath warm against his ear. "I'm trying not to make you look like you stuck your finger in a light socket." Might be an improvement over the wanted poster. Sarah Mae paused in her cutting. "Jacob, can I ask you something?" "Of course. The cross you carry, the wooden one. I've seen you take it out at night sometimes when you think I'm sleeping." Jacob's hand moved instinctively to his shirt pocket, where the small carved cross rested against his chest. "It was Samuel's. He carved it himself when he was a boy." "And you still believe, after everything that's happened?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from their campfire. Jacob was quiet for so long that Sarah Mae began to think he wouldn't answer. "I want to," he said finally. "But it's hard to believe in justice and mercy when your own a brother can look you in the eye and lie about watching you commit murder." Sarah Mae resumed cutting, her movements gentle and sure. "My daddy used to say that faith wasn't about believing when things were easy. It was about believing when everything fell apart." Your daddy sounds like a wise man. He was. Also a drunk who could barely keep food on the table, but wise in his way. She paused to assess her work. "He used to tell me that sometimes God's mercy looks different than we expect it to." "What do you mean?" "Well, if you hadn't been framed for murder, you never would have ended up on that auction block. And if you hadn't been on that auction block, I never would have had a reason to spend my last dollar buying your freedom." And if I hadn't bought your freedom, I'd still be traveling alone, scared and pregnant and running from my past. Jacob turned to look at her, careful not to disrupt her work. You think God arranged for my brother to destroy my life so that we could meet? I think maybe God takes the terrible things people do to each other and finds ways to make something beautiful out of them. Maybe your freedom, real freedom, not just legal freedom, was always supposed to come through helping someone else find theirs. It was a radical thought, one that challenged everything Jacob had believed about justice and fairness. But sitting there by the firelight, feeling Sarah Mae's gentle hands in his hair, he found himself wanting to believe it might be true. "There," Sarah Mae said, stepping back to examine her handiwork. "What do you think?" Jacob looked at his reflection in the mirror and barely recognized himself. The clean-shaven face and shorter hair had transformed him completely. He looked like a respectable citizen, the kind of man who might own a small business or work as a bank clerk. "It's different. Good different? I think so. My turn." Sarah Mae had rinsed the lemon juice mixture from her hair, and the change was already visible. Her hair had lightened to a honey brown with distinct blonde highlights. Now she sat on the log beside the creek, while Jacob carefully cut away nearly 8 inches of length, shaping it into a fashionable bob that barely touched her shoulders. "I feel naked," she said, running her fingers through the shorter strands. "You look beautiful." The words slipped out before Jacob could stop them, and he felt heat rise in his cheeks. But Sarah Mae didn't seem offended. Instead, she smiled and touched her hair self-consciously. "Thomas always said he married me for my hair, said it reminded him of autumn leaves." "Thomas sounds like he was a fool." "Why do you say that?" Jacob set down the scissors and moved to sit beside her on the log. "Because if a man marries a woman for her hair, he's missing everything that really matters about her." Sarah Mae felt something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the baby. And what really matters? Her courage, her kindness, the way she makes decisions with her heart instead of her head, even when it scares her. The way she sees the best in people, even when they can't see it in themselves. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his words settling between them. Sarah Mae realized that Jacob wasn't just describing her, he was describing the way he saw her. And the way he saw her was nothing like the way she'd learned to see herself. "Jacob, yes? When this is all over, when we get to California and you're free to go wherever you want, what will you do?" Jacob stared into the fire, considering the question. For months, his only goal had been survival. He'd never allowed himself to think beyond the immediate need to stay alive and avoid capture. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've been running for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to do anything else." "Well, when you figure it out, I hope you'll remember that some of us believe you deserve to be happy." Jacob looked at her then, really. Looked at her and saw something in her eyes that made his chest tight. It wasn't pity or charity. It was something warmer, something that made him want to believe that maybe happiness was possible, even for a man like him. "Sarah Mae, yes? Tomorrow, when we ride into the next town, we won't be Jacob Sterling and Sarah Mae Henderson anymore. We'll be John and Mary Thompson. I know, but I want you to know, whatever names we use, whatever lies we have to tell to stay safe, what I feel for you is real." Sarah Mae's breath caught. "Jacob, I know it's not fair to tell you that. I know I don't have the right to feel anything for you when I can't promise you a future. But I needed you to know, before we become other people, that the man you saved from that auction block is falling in love with you." The words hung between them like a bridge. Neither of them was sure they should cross. Sarah Mae looked down at her hands, at the worn wedding ring that suddenly felt like a lie. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Of me, of this, of caring about you and losing you, of letting myself hope for something I might not be able to have." Jacob reached over and took her hand in his. "Then we'll be scared together. John and Mary Thompson can be braver than Jacob Sterling and Sarah Mae Henderson ever were." Sarah Mae squeezed his hand and managed a smile. "All right, but I should warn you, Mary Thompson is going to expect her husband to be more romantic than practical, I think. John Thompson can manage that. As they settled down for the night, their bedrolls placed closer together than they had been the night before, Sarah Mae found herself thinking about transformation. Tomorrow, they would wake up as different people, with different names and different histories. But the feelings growing between them, those would remain the same. She touched the wooden cross that Jacob had given her for safekeeping, feeling the smooth grain beneath her fingers. Maybe her father had been right about God's mercy, looking different than expected. Maybe sometimes salvation came disguised as danger, and freedom came wrapped in chains. Maybe love came from the most unlikely places of all. The town of Cedar Falls appeared through the morning haze like a mirage, its whitewashed buildings and church steeple a welcome sight after 4 days of hard riding through increasingly rough country. Sarah Mae, Mary Thompson now, she reminded herself, shifted uncomfortably in her saddle, one hand pressed to the small of her aching back. "Easy there, Mrs. Thompson," Jacob said, his voice carrying the careful concern of a devoted husband. "We'll be able to rest soon." The transformation in his manner was as complete as the change in his appearance. Gone was the wary, defensive man from the auction block. In his place rode John Thompson, a prosperous young farmer taking his pregnant wife west to claim land in California. His posture was more relaxed, his smile came easier, and he'd adopted a slight drawl that suggested origins in Kentucky rather than Colorado. "I'm fine, Mr. Thompson," Sarah Mae replied, playing her part, "just eager to sleep in a real bed again." They'd practiced their new identities during the long hours on the trail, creating a shared history that would stand up to casual questioning. John Thompson was the younger son of a tobacco farmer, educated enough to read and write, but practical enough to work with his hands. Mary was the daughter of a preacher, raised with strict moral values, but possessed of enough adventurous spirit to follow her husband into the unknown territories. Most importantly, they were deeply in love, a young couple so devoted to each other that they were willing to leave everything familiar behind for the chance to build a life together. It was a story that would explain their obvious intimacy while accounting for any protective behavior John might display toward his wife. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah Mae that the most convincing part of their performance would be the part that required the least acting. Cedar Falls was larger than Perdition Creek, but smaller than the mining towns they'd passed through earlier. It had the settled feel of a community that expected to endure, with established businesses and houses that showed signs of care and investment. A good place for a young couple to spend a few days recuperating from the trail. They approached the livery stable first, where a grizzled man in leather apron looked up from shoeing a horse. "Help you folks? Looking for a place to stable our horses and maybe get directions to a decent hotel," Jacob said, dismounting and moving to help Sarah Mae down from her saddle. His hands were gentle as they encircled her waist, and he held her a moment longer. "Than strictly necessary. Miller's Hotel is your best bet," the blacksmith said, eyeing Sarah Mae's condition with the automatic sympathy most folks showed pregnant women. "Clean beds, good food, and Mrs. Miller doesn't mind if guests stay a few extra days. You folks heading west?" "California," Sarah Mae said, accepting Jacob's steadying arm as they walked. "My husband's cousin has a farm near Sacramento. Says there's good land to be had for those willing to work it." "Long journey for a lady in your condition." "The baby's not due for another 3 months," Sarah Mae replied with a smile that suggested she'd heard this concern before. "Plenty of time to get settled before the little one arrives." The blacksmith nodded approvingly. "Smart thinking. Too many folks try to cut it close and end up birthing babies on the trail. I'll take good care of your horses. That's a fine mare you've got there." "Thank you. Bessie's been with my family since I was a girl." As they walked toward the hotel, Sarah Mae was acutely aware of Jacob's hand resting lightly on her elbow, guiding her around the deeper ruts in the street. The gesture was protective without being possessive, the kind of consideration a loving husband would show his pregnant wife. Miller's Hotel was a two-story building with a wide front porch and lace curtains in the windows. Mrs. Miller herself greeted them at the desk, a motherly woman with graying hair and kind eyes who took one look at Sarah Mae and immediately began fussing. "Oh, you poor dear, you look exhausted. How far have you traveled today?" "About 15 miles, Jacob said. "We've been pushing hard to make good time, but I think Mary needs a few days' rest." "Of course she does. Look at her. She's ready to drop. I have a lovely room on the second floor, nice and quiet, with a view of the mountains, and I'll have my girl bring up some hot water for a bath." "That sounds wonderful," Sarah Mae said gratefully. "We've been on the trail for over a week." Mrs. Miller clucked sympathetically as she led them upstairs. "Traveling in your condition, you must be anxious to reach your destination. Is this your first child?" Sarah Mae felt a familiar pang at the question, but her answer came smoothly. "Yes. We're both nervous and excited." "Nothing to be nervous about, dear. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. The important thing is to get plenty of rest and eat well." Mrs. Miller opened the door to a comfortable room with a large bed, washstand and chairs by the window. "Now I'll have Susie bring up that bath water and you just rest yourself. Dinner's at 6 and I'm making pot roast tonight." When Mrs. Miller left them alone, Sarah Mae sank into one of the chairs with a sigh of relief. The constant vigilance of the trail, combined with the physical demands of her pregnancy, had left her more exhausted than she'd wanted to admit. "You did well," Jacob said quietly, checking to make sure the door was securely closed. "Very convincing. It helps that most of it's true. I'm tired, I'm pregnant, and I do need rest." She looked up at him with a small smile. "You're quite the actor yourself, Mr. Thompson. Years of practice at being someone other than myself." The comment carried an undertone of sadness that made Sarah Mae study his face more carefully. "Jacob, John," he corrected gently. "Even when we're alone, we should practice. It's safer that way." "John, then. Are you all right? You seem different since we changed our names." Jacob moved to the window and looked out at the street below. "It's strange, pretending to be someone else, someone better than I actually am." "What do you mean?" "John Thompson is a good man. Honest, hard-working, devoted to his wife. He's never killed anyone, never been accused of murder, never spent months in chains, wondering if he'd die before he could prove his innocence." Jacob's voice was quiet but intense. "Sometimes I wonder if you'd be better off with him instead of me." Sarah Mae struggled to her feet and crossed to where he stood. "John Thompson doesn't exist. He's a story we made up to keep us safe. Maybe. But the way you look at him, at me, when I'm being him, it's different." "How is it different?" Jacob turned to face her, and she saw vulnerability in his green eyes that took her breath away. "You look at him like he deserves to be loved." The words hung between them like a challenge. Sarah Mae reached up to touch his freshly shaven cheek, marveling at how young and handsome he looked without the beard. "Jacob Sterling deserves to be loved too. The real Jacob Sterling, not the man on the bounty poster, not the killer. Your brother wants everyone to believe you are. The man who's been nothing but gentle with me, who's protected me and cared for me and never asked for anything in return. I've asked for plenty. I've asked you to risk your life, to give up your identity, to trust me when you have no reason to. You've asked me to be brave, and I've never felt braver than I do when I'm with you." Jacob's hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. "Sarah Mae, Mary," she corrected with a smile. "Even when we're alone, remember? Mary." He said her new name like a prayer. "God help me, I'm falling so hard for you that I can't see straight." "Then, don't try to see straight, just fall." The kiss was inevitable. Gentle at first, then deeper as they both stopped fighting the attraction that had been building between them for days. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "This is dangerous," Jacob whispered against her forehead. "Everything about our situation is dangerous. At least this kind of danger feels good." A knock at the door interrupted them, and they sprang apart like guilty teenagers. "Bath water," called a cheerful voice from the hallway. "Coming," Sarah Mae called back, smoothing her hair and checking her appearance in the mirror above the washstand. To Jacob, she whispered, "We'll continue this conversation later." "Will we?" "Count on it, Mr. Thompson." The next 3 days in Cedar Falls passed in a blur of careful domesticity. They took their meals in the hotel dining room where the guests and local residents gradually accepted them as the devoted young couple they appeared to be. Jacob proved remarkably adept at the role of attentive husband, helping Sarah Mae with her chair, ensuring she ate enough at meals, and engaging in just the right amount of casual conversation with other travelers. But it was the private moments that revealed the depth of their growing connection. The way Jacob insisted on helping her with her boots each morning, his hands gentle on her swollen ankles. The way Sarah Mae automatically reached for him during the night, her hand finding his across the space between their separate beds. The way they talked for hours in the evening, sharing stories from their real past while building the fictional history of John and Mary Thompson. On their third night in Cedar Falls, Sarah Mae woke to find Jacob standing by the window, staring out at the darkened street. "What is it?" she asked quietly. "Riders. 3 of them came into town about an hour ago. They've been asking questions at the saloon." Sarah Mae's blood ran cold. "About us?" "About a wanted man traveling with a pregnant woman. The description matches the bounty poster." She sat up in bed, suddenly fully awake. "How close did they get?" "Close enough. The bartender told them he hadn't seen anyone matching that description, but they're planning to check with Mrs. Miller in the morning." Sarah Mae's mind raced. "We need to leave. Tonight." "That's what I was thinking, but Mary..." "What?" Jacob turned from the window, and in the moonlight she could see the conflict on his face. Running in the middle of the night is going to raise questions. If we leave now, Mrs. Miller will remember us as the couple who disappeared without paying their bill. If the bounty hunters are systematic, they'll ask about any suspicious behavior. So what do you suggest? We stay. We trust our disguises and our story, and we brazen it out. Sarah Mae felt her stomach clench with fear. And if they recognize you, then we run. Fast and far. It was a terrible gamble, but Sarah Mae realized Jacob was right. Running now would only confirm their guilt if they were caught later. Better to face the danger head-on and hope their transformation had been complete enough to fool even experienced hunters. "All right," she said, "we stay. But John?" "Yes? If this goes wrong, if they figure out who we are, I want you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll run. Don't try to protect me. Don't try to be heroic. Just run and save yourself." Jacob crossed to her bed and knelt beside it, taking her hands in his. "Mary Thompson, I'm going to promise you something, but it's not what you asked for." "What?" "I promise that whatever happens tomorrow, we face it together. No running, no abandoning each other, no noble sacrifices. We're partners now, and partners don't leave each other behind." Sarah Mae squeezed his hands tightly. "That's a dangerous promise. It's the only one I'm willing to make." As they settled back into their beds to wait for dawn, Sarah Mae found herself thinking about the nature of courage. For most of her life, she'd thought courage meant facing danger alone, depending only on herself. But lying there in the darkness, knowing that bounty hunters were sleeping just down the street, she realized that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was trust someone else with your life. Marcus stood near the center of the circle, talking quietly with Marshal Garrett and the territorial judge. When he saw Jacob and Sarah Mae approaching, his expression shifted to one of calculated sympathy. "Jacob," he called out, stepping forward, with open arms. "Thank God you've finally come to your senses. I've been so worried about you." The performance was flawless. The concerned brother, relieved to see his wayward sibling ready to face justice. If Jacob hadn't known better, he might have believed it himself. "Hello, Marcus. And this must be the poor woman you've been dragging around the countryside." Marcus turned to Sarah Mae with a charming smile. "Ma'am, I want you to know that we're going to make sure you're treated fairly. No one blames you for anything that's happened. You were clearly coerced into helping him. Sarah Mae's response was cool and measured. Thank you for your concern, Mr. Sterling. But I haven't been coerced into anything. I'm here by choice. Marcus's smile faltered slightly. Of course. Of course. The important thing is that this ordeal is finally over. Marshal Garrett stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Jacob Sterling, you're under arrest for the murder of Samuel Morrison and the theft of... Wait. Chief Ironbear's voice cut through the formal proceedings like a knife. Before arrests are made, there is evidence to be presented. Evidence that changes everything. The marshal looked confused. What evidence? Evidence that proves Jacob Sterling is innocent, Sarah Mae said clearly, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd. And evidence that proves who really killed Samuel Morrison. Marcus's face went very still. What are you talking about? Chief Ironbear nodded to one of his warriors who brought forward a leather bundle. With ceremonial care, the chief unwrapped the contents and placed them on a buffalo hide in the center of the circle. The blood-stained bandana lay there like an accusation, its blue fabric dark with old blood. Beside it was Samuel's pocket watch, his rings, and the folded letter that contained his final will. These items were found in your belongings, Marcus Sterling, Chief Ironbear announced. Items that belong to the murdered man. Items that prove you killed Samuel Morrison and tried to blame your brother. The silence that followed was complete and terrible. Marcus stared at the evidence with the expression of a man watching his world collapse. Then slowly, his shock transformed into something far more dangerous. You went through my things, he said quietly. You had no right. We had every right, Jacob said, stepping forward. Just like you had no right to kill the man who raised us. Just like you had no right to frame me for your crime. You can't prove anything with those. Those could belong to anyone. Sarah Mae moved to stand beside Jacob, her hand resting on his arm. Read the letter, Marcus. Read Samuel's final will. Read what he really thought of you. Jacob picked up the letter and began to read aloud, his voice growing stronger with each word. As the contents of Samuel's final message became clear, the assembled crowd began to murmur. The evidence was damning, not just the physical items, but the written testimony of a dead man who'd seen his killer's true nature. Marcus listened to it all with the stillness of a predator calculating his options. When Jacob finished reading, Marcus began to laugh, a sound that made everyone present take an involuntary step backward. You think this proves anything? Marcus asked, his voice carrying an edge of hysteria. You think anyone will believe the word of a wanted murderer and his pregnant whore over mine? The insult hung in the air like a slap. Jacob's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but Sarah Mae's touch on his arm stopped him. The evidence speaks for itself, she said calmly. Samuel's blood on his bandana, his personal effects in your possession, his written testimony about your theft and his fears for his safety. Even you can't talk your way out of this, Marcus. Marcus's facade finally cracked completely. The charming smile vanished, replaced by a snarl of pure rage. You always were too smart for your own good, Jacob. Samuel thought so too. That's why he had to die. The admission sent a shock through the assembled crowd. Marshal Garrett stepped forward, his hand now firmly on his weapon. Marcus Sterling, you're under arrest for the murder of Samuel Morrison. But Marcus was no longer listening to official proclamations. His eyes were fixed on Jacob with a hatred that had been building for over a year. His hand moved toward his gun with the fluid motion of a man who'd been preparing for this moment. If I'm going to hang anyway, Marcus said conversationally, I might as well make sure you don't live to see it. The crisis Jacob had been dreading was finally at hand. In seconds, bullets would fly and lives would be forever changed. Everything they'd worked for, everything they'd risked, would come down to who was faster with a gun. But as Marcus's hand closed around his weapon, Jacob realized something that changed everything. He wasn't afraid anymore. The broken man from the auction block was gone, replaced by someone who had something worth fighting for, someone who had finally learned the difference between surviving and living, someone who was about to discover which kind of man he really was. The birth certificate that would forever change their lives was still hours away from being written, but as Marcus Sterling's hand closed around his gun, Sarah Mae felt the first sharp contraction tear through her body, like lightning. "Jacob!" she gasped, doubling over as pain radiated from her lower back through her entire abdomen. Time seemed to fracture into a series of disconnected moments, Marcus drawing his weapon with the smooth confidence of a man who'd killed before. Jacob's hand moving toward his own gun, even as he turned towards Sarah Mae's cry. Marshal Garrett shouting orders that were lost in the sudden chaos as witnesses scattered or dove for cover. But it was Chief Iron Bear who moved fastest of all. The tribal leader's war cry split the air as he launched himself at Marcus, his weathered hands closing around the younger man's gun arm just as the weapon cleared leather. The two men went down in a tangle of limbs, fighting for control of the pistol, while Jacob dropped to his knees beside Sarah Mae. "The baby," she panted, her face pale with pain and shock. "Something's wrong, it's too early." Jacob's training with battlefield injuries kicked in, his hands gentle but sure as he helped her lie back on the buffalo hide that had been spread for the evidence. How bad is the pain? Bad, really bad. Another contraction hit her, and she gripped his hand so tightly. He could feel her fingernails cutting into his palm. "Jacob, I'm scared." Around them, the council ground had erupted into controlled chaos. Marcus and Chief Iron Bear were still wrestling for the gun, the older man's wiry strength proving equal to Marcus's desperate fury. Marshal Garrett and his deputies had their weapons drawn, but couldn't get a clear shot without risking hitting the chief. "Winona!" Jacob shouted over the din. "We need Winona!" The elderly tribal healer was already pushing through the crowd, her weathered face calm despite the violence erupting around her. She knelt beside Sarah Mae and began speaking in rapid Lakota to the other tribal women, who quickly formed a protective circle around the laboring woman. "Too much excitement," Winona said, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she examined Sarah Mae. "Baby decides to come early, very early. Can you help her?" Jacob asked, his eyes darting between Sarah Mae's pale face and the ongoing struggle between Marcus and Chief Iron Bear. "Can try, but need quiet, need calm. This," she gestured at the chaos around them, "this no good for birthing." A gunshot cracked through the air and everyone froze. Marcus had managed to fire his weapon, but the shot went wide, burying itself harmlessly in a tree trunk 20 feet away. Chief Iron Bear used the momentary distraction to wrench the gun completely away from Marcus and toss it to one of his warriors. "Enough!" Marshal Garrett's voice boomed across the council ground. "Marcus Sterling, you're under arrest for the murder of Samuel Morrison. You just confessed in front of 20 witnesses." Marcus struggled to his feet, his face bloody from the fight with Chief Iron Bear. But instead of the defeated look Jacob expected, his brother wore an expression of twisted satisfaction. "You think this is over?" Marcus laughed, spitting blood into the dirt. "You think arresting me solves anything? Look around you, little brother. Your pregnant whore is about to drop her bastard in the dirt. You're still a wanted man in 3 territories, and I've got friends who'll make sure you never live to see that baby grow up." The threats sent a chill through Jacob that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Even defeated, even exposed, Marcus was still dangerous. The network of contacts he'd built during his year-long manhunt wouldn't simply disappear because he'd been arrested. "Jacob," Sarah Mae called weakly. "Don't listen to him, come here." Jacob immediately returned to her side, taking her hand as another contraction racked her body. But he could see the fear in her eyes, not just from the premature labor, but from the realization that their troubles might not end with Marcus's capture. "The baby's coming whether we're ready or not," Winona announced grimly. "Need to move her somewhere safe, somewhere warm." "My lodge," Chief Iron Bear said immediately, his own face showing concern despite the blood on his knuckles, "is closest. My women will help." As they carefully lifted Sarah Mae and began moving her toward the lodge, Jacob felt his world narrowing to a single, desperate focus: keeping both Sarah Mae and their baby alive. Everything else, the evidence, the arrest, even his own vindication, suddenly seemed secondary to the woman whose courage had saved him in every way that mattered. "Stay with me," Sarah Mae whispered as they carried her. "Promise me you'll stay." "I'm not going anywhere," Jacob replied, though his eyes kept scanning the crowd for other threats. Marcus had been captured, but his two companions were still somewhere in the area, still armed, still dangerous. "Mr. Sterling," Marshal Garrett appeared at his elbow, his expression grave. "I need to ask you to come with me. There are formal charges to be filed, statements to be taken." "Not now," Jacob said firmly. "My wife is having our baby. Everything else can wait." "Sir, with all due respect, there are procedures." "Marshal," Chief Ironbear interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. "In our way, when woman gives birth, all other business stops. Nothing more important than bringing new life safely into world. Your procedures can wait." The federal marshal looked like he wanted to argue, but something in the chief's tone made him reconsider. "All right, but I'll need to post guards for everyone's safety." As they reached the lodge, Sarah Mae let out a cry that cut through Jacob like a knife. Whatever was happening, it was happening fast. Too fast for comfort, too fast for safety. "Winona," Jacob said urgently, as they settled Sarah Mae onto the bed of furs that had been prepared. "Is she going to be all right? Is the baby?" The elderly Hila's expression was carefully neutral as she continued her examination. "Babies come when they're ready, not when we want them to. This little one very eager to see world. But it's too early. She's only 7 months along." 7-month babies can live, can be strong, but Winona paused, her weathered hands gentle on Sarah Mae's abdomen. "Will be difficult birth. Baby not in right position. Will need to turn." Jacob felt the bottom drop out of his world. After everything they'd survived, after all the dangers they'd faced together, the greatest threat might come from the very thing that was supposed to represent their hope for the future. "What can I do?" he asked desperately. "Pray," Winona said simply. "Pray to your God, to our spirits, to whatever power you believe in, and stay close. She will need your strength for what comes next." Outside the lodge, they could hear Marshal Garrett organizing his men, could hear the sounds of Marcus being secured for transport. Justice was finally being served. Truth was finally prevailing over lies. But inside the lodge, as Sarah Mae gripped Jacob's hand through another contraction, the only truth that mattered was the one written in her eyes. Their love had created something beautiful and precious, and now they had to fight to bring it safely into the world. The birth certificate that would make their child a legitimate citizen was still unwritten, but the love that would make their child cherished was already complete. The marriage certificate lay on the small wooden table beside the bed, its official seal still wet with ink as Jacob signed his name with a trembling hand. Outside the lodge, dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed to promise hope despite the exhaustion etched on every face. "There," said the territorial judge, a kind-faced man who'd insisted on performing the ceremony despite the unconventional circumstances. "John and Mary Thompson are now legally husband and wife, and this little one," he gestured toward the tiny bundle in Sarah Mae's arms, "is now legally their child." Sarah Mae looked down at the baby she'd fought so hard to bring into the world. The labor had lasted through the night, complicated and dangerous, with moments when both Winona and Jacob feared they might lose both mother and child. But as the sun rose, so had the thin, urgent cry of their daughter, small but fierce, determined to live despite her early arrival. "She's perfect," Sarah Mae whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of labor. "Look at her, Jacob. She's absolutely perfect." Jacob knelt beside the bed, his large hands gentle as he touched his daughter's tiny fist. 7 months in the womb had left her smaller than a full-term baby, but her grip was strong when she wrapped her fingers around his thumb. Her eyes, when they opened, were the same green as his own. "What will you call her?" Judge Morrison asked, preparing to fill out the birth certificate. Sarah Mae and Jacob exchanged a look that spoke of shared understanding. They'd discussed names during the long weeks on the trail, but now, looking at their daughter's determined little face, only one seemed right. "Hope," Sarah Mae said without hesitation. "Hope Thompson." "A beautiful name for a beautiful child," the judge agreed, writing carefully on the official document. "Born October 15th, 1875, to John and Mary Thompson." "Of the Colorado Territory," Jacob said firmly. "We're going home." The decision had crystallized during the long night of labor as Jacob held Sarah Mae's hand through each contraction and watched her fight to bring their child safely into the world. They'd spent too long running, too long hiding behind false names and fabricated histories. Their daughter deserved to know where she came from, deserved to inherit the land that was rightfully theirs. "Are you sure?" Sarah Mae asked quietly. "Marcus may be in custody, but he still has allies." "Let them come," Jacob said, and there was steel in his voice that hadn't been there on the auction block all those months ago. "I'm done being afraid of shadows and lies. Samuel left me that ranch, and our daughter is going to grow up on it." A gentle knock at the lodge entrance interrupted them. Chief Iron Bear appeared, his weathered face creasing into a rare smile when he saw the baby. "The little warrior has arrived safely," he observed with satisfaction. "Good. The spirits have blessed this union." "Any word about Marcus?" Jacob asked. "Marshall took him away this morning. Will face trial in territorial court. With evidence. We found, with witnesses to his confession, he will hang." The chief's expression grew more serious. "But you should know. His companions escaped during the night. 3 men, still armed, still loyal to him." Jacob felt Sarah Mae tense beside him, her arms instinctively tightening around the baby. "How much of a threat are they?" "Hard to say. Without Marcus to lead them, they may just disappear. Or they may seek revenge." Chief Iron Bear studied Jacob's face carefully. "You have decision to make. Stay here, where my people can protect you, or go back to Colorado and face whatever comes." "We're going back," Jacob said without hesitation. "This has to end somewhere, and it might as well be on our own land." Sarah Mae reached for his hand. "Our land," she corrected gently. "Whatever we face together." The judge finished preparing the official documents, birth certificate, marriage license, and a letter of testimony regarding the evidence that had cleared Jacob's name. "These should be sufficient to establish your legal identity and clear up any outstanding warrants," he said, "though I'd recommend checking with the federal marshal's office when you reach Colorado." "Thank you," Jacob said, shaking the man's hand, "for everything." As the judge gathered his papers and prepared to leave, he paused at the lodge entrance. "Mr. Thompson, or should I say Mr. Sterling, can I offer you some advice?" "Of course." "Don't let your brother's crimes define your life. You've been given a second chance, a new wife, a new daughter, a new beginning. Use it wisely." When they were alone, except for Winona, who was quietly tidying up the birthing supplies, Sarah Mae struggled to sit up straighter in the bed. "Jacob, are you absolutely certain about going back? It's not just us anymore. We have hope to think about." Jacob looked down at his daughter, who was sleeping peacefully despite all the chaos that had surrounded her birth. "That's exactly why we have to go back. I want her to grow up knowing her father isn't a coward who ran from trouble. I want her to inherit land that belongs to her, not live in exile because of another man's lies. And if Marcus's friends are waiting for us, then we'll deal with them. But Sarah Mae, I've learned something these past few months. Running from trouble doesn't make it go away. It just makes you weak from always looking over your shoulder. I'd rather face whatever's coming head-on." Winona approached the bed with a small leather pouch. "For the journey," she said, pressing it into Sarah Mae's hands. herbs for healing, for strength, and this, she pulled out a small dream catcher, perfectly sized for a baby's cradle. For little hope, to catch bad dreams, let good ones through. Thank you, Sarah Mae said, tears springing to her eyes, for everything. You saved our lives. You saved your own lives. I just helped a baby find her way into world. Winona smiled and touched Hope's tiny cheek. This one will be strong, can see it in her spirit. She will grow up to be warrior like her parents. As the day progressed, Jacob found himself making practical preparations for their journey to Colorado. Chief Iron Bear's warriors had recovered. The horses and supplies and the tribal women had prepared food and medicine for the trail. Most importantly, they'd found a gentle mare who'd recently lost her foal. A horse who could carry Sarah Mae and the baby safely. How long before we can travel? Jacob asked Winona, as she examined Sarah Mae one final time. 3 days? Maybe 4. She needs rest, needs strength to return. Baby too small for hard traveling. But if you go slow, take many stops, the healer shrugged. Is possible. That evening, as they sat around the fire with Hope sleeping peacefully between them, Sarah Mae finally asked the question that had been weighing on her mind. Jacob, what if we get to Colorado and find out the ranch has been sold? What if Samuel's false will was already probated? Then we'll contest it in court. We have the real will now, witnesses to Marcus's confession, evidence of his crimes. It might take time, but we'll get what's rightfully ours. And in the meantime, Jacob reached across their sleeping daughter to take Sarah Mae's hand. In the meantime, we have each other. We have hope. We have more than I ever thought possible when I was standing on that auction block. Sarah Mae squeezed his hand and looked down at their daughter. Do you think she'll ever understand how much she was wanted? How hard we fought for the chance to give her a life? I think she'll understand that she was born out of love, Jacob said softly. Born to parents who were willing to risk everything. For each other and for her, that's a pretty good beginning for any life. As the fire burned low and the mountain night settled around them, Jacob found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the auction block to the marriage certificate, from desperation to hope, from Jacob Sterling, the wanted fugitive, to John Thompson, the proud father. Tomorrow, they would begin the journey home to Colorado, to the ranch that was rightfully theirs, to whatever dangers still awaited them. But tonight, in the warm glow of the firelight, they were simply a family, complete, legitimate, and ready to face whatever the future might hold. The marriage certificate crackled softly in the evening breeze, its official seal catching this firelight like a promise of legitimacy and belonging. They were no longer running toward something, they were finally running home. The family portrait sat proudly on the mantelpiece of the ranch house, its silver frame catching the afternoon sunlight that streamed through windows Sarah Mae had personally cleaned until they sparkled. 3 months had passed since their return to Colorado. 3 months of rebuilding not just a ranch, but a life that had been torn apart by lies and betrayal. In the photograph, taken by the traveling photographer who'd passed through their valley. Just last week, Jacob stood behind Sarah Mae's chair with his hand resting gently on her shoulder. Sarah Mae sat holding baby Hope, now 4 months old and thriving despite her early arrival. All 3 of them were smiling, not the careful, guarded expressions of people still looking over their shoulders, but the genuine happiness of a family that had finally found peace. She's getting so big, Sarah Mae mused, looking from the photograph to the baby, currently sleeping in the carved wooden cradle Jacob had built with his own hands. Hard to believe she was ever so small, we worried she might not make it. Jacob finished reviewing the ranch's account books and moved to stand behind his wife's chair, recreating the pose from the photograph. She's a fighter, gets that from her mother, and her stubbornness from her father. I prefer to call it determination. Sarah Mae leaned back against Jacob's solid warmth, marveling at how natural this domestic happiness felt. The ranch house that had once belonged to Samuel Morrison was slowly becoming their own, filled with the sounds and scents of family life. Sarah Mae's herb garden flourished in the kitchen yard. Jacob's improvements to the barn and fences showed everywhere, and Hope's baby things were scattered throughout the house in the cheerful chaos of new parenthood. The legal battles had been resolved more quickly than anyone expected. Marcus Sterling's confession, witnessed by federal officials and tribal leaders, had invalidated his claims to Samuel Morrison's estate. The real will had been accepted by the territorial court, and Jacob's name had been officially cleared of all charges. Marcus himself now sat in the territorial prison awaiting execution, his charm finally proving insufficient to escape the consequences of his crimes. "Any word from Marshal Garrett about Marcus's companions?" Sarah Mae asked, though the question held less urgency than it would have months ago. They scattered to the wind after Marcus was arrested. "Garrett thinks they've probably left the territory entirely." Jacob's voice was calm, confident. "Cowards like that don't stick around once their leader is gone." It was true. The three men who'd helped Marcus hunt them across half the continent had proven to be mercenaries interested only in easy money. With Marcus in custody and no bounty left to collect, they'd simply vanished back into whatever holes they'd crawled out of. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the window. A small group of riders was coming up the valley road. Not the furtive, dangerous men they'd once feared, but neighbors coming for the weekly gathering that had become a tradition at the Morrison Ranch. "That looks like the Hendersons and the McLeods," Sarah Mae observed, beginning to gather the preparations for their guests. "And I think I see Pastor Williams with them." Jacob smiled as he watched their friends approach. Building relationships with their neighbors had been one of the most rewarding aspects of their return to Colorado. Once the truth about Marcus's crimes became known, the local community had embraced Jacob and Sarah Mae with an enthusiasm that still surprised them. The ranch that had once been isolated by suspicion was now the social center of the valley. "I'll put coffee on," Sarah Mae said, rising carefully. Her recovery from Hope's difficult birth had been complete, but she'd learned to be more mindful of her physical limitations. "And that apple pie I made this morning should be perfect by now." As their friends arrived and filled the house with laughter and conversation, Jacob found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The man who'd stood broken and defeated on that auction block in Perdition Creek seemed like someone from another lifetime. That man had been defined by what he'd lost: his freedom, his reputation, his hope for the future. The man he'd become was defined by what he'd gained: a wife who'd risked everything for love, a daughter who represented endless possibility, a home that was truly his own, and a community that valued him for who he was, rather than what he'd been accused of. "Jacob," Pastor Williams approached him with a warm smile and a firm handshake. "Sarah Mae tells me you're thinking about expanding the cattle operation." "That's right. With beef prices rising and the railroad coming through next year, it seems like good timing." Jacob's voice carried the confidence of a man who'd learned to plan for the future instead of just surviving from day to day. "Smart thinking. And if you need help with the roundup come spring, my boys would be glad to lend a hand." It was gestures like this, neighbors offering help, friends planning for next year's activities, that made Jacob realize how completely their lives had transformed. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were thriving, building something lasting and meaningful. As the afternoon wore on and their guests eventually departed, Jacob and Sarah Mae settled into their evening routine. Hope nursed contentedly while Sarah Mae rocked her by the fireplace, and Jacob worked on plans for the new barn he wanted to build before winter set in. "Jacob," Sarah Mae said quietly, not wanting to wake the baby, "do you ever think about how different things might have been if I hadn't seen you on that auction block?" "Every day," he replied honestly, "but not with regret, with gratitude. Even knowing all the danger we went through, all the times we almost lost everything." Jacob set down his pencil and looked at his wife and daughter, silhouetted against the firelight. Sarah Mae, if you hadn't bought my freedom that day, I would have died in chains, bitter and broken, and convinced that justice was a lie. Instead, I'm sitting in my own house, planning improvements to my own land, watching my wife nurse our daughter. If that's not worth every danger we faced, I don't know what would be." Sarah Mae smiled and shifted Hope to her shoulder, patting the baby's back gently. "When I think about what we've built here, not just the ranch, but our family, our place in the community, it amazes me. A year ago, I was a pregnant widow with no future and no hope. Now you're the most respected woman in the valley, mother to the most beautiful baby in Colorado, and wife to a man who loves you more than his own life. And you're a successful rancher, a pillar of the community, and the father who's going to teach our daughter that she can accomplish anything she sets her mind to." Hope stirred in her mother's arms, making the small sounds that meant she was waking up. Jacob rose from his chair and gently took his daughter, cradling her against his chest with the natural ease of a devoted father. "What do you think, little Hope?" he asked softly. "Think you're going to like growing up on a cattle ranch?" As if in response, Hope opened her green eyes and looked up at her father with the serious expression that never failed to make both parents smile. She was going to be a formidable woman someday, Jacob realized. Strong like her mother, determined like her father, and raised with the absolute certainty that she was loved and wanted and capable of anything. "Time for bed, I think," Sarah Mae said, standing and stretching. "For all of us." As they prepared for sleep in the bedroom they'd slowly made their own, Jacob found himself looking again at the family portrait on the dresser. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: cattle to tend, fences to mend, neighbors to help with their own problems. But tonight, in the quiet sanctuary of their home, they were simply a family at peace with themselves and their place in the world. The silver frame of the portrait caught the lamplight one last time as Jacob extinguished the flame. In the darkness, Sarah Mae moved closer to him, and Hope slept peacefully in her cradle between their bed and the window. Outside, the Colorado wind whispered through the valley that was theirs now, carrying with it the promise of seasons yet to come, of children yet to be born, of a future built on love and sustained by the kind of courage that had brought them together in the first place. The broken compass that had once symbolized their uncertainty sat forgotten in a drawer downstairs. They no longer needed it to find their direction. They had found their true north in each other, and it would guide them through whatever adventures lay ahead.